Hello, everyone. And on behalf of Humanities Tennessee and our key sponsors, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books, welcome to another session of the 33rd Annual and Second Online Southern Festival of Books. If you are watching on Facebook Live or YouTube, feel free to submit any questions you have during the panel discussion, and we'll try to answer them during the Q&A. We have an incredible Abby. I don't know why I said an incredible Abby, but she'll be taking the comments and questions and moving them from Facebook and YouTube over to our chat here. We want to encourage everyone to buy these incredible books. I've got the dust jacket off of one of them. From Parnassus Books in Nashville, your purchase of these books from Parnassus helps keep the festival free. You should be able to find the links to buy these books at the top of the chat. Snaps for Parnassus, they're incredible, and if anyone's going to separate you from your cash, make it an independent bookstore. This is my best NPR voice. The Southern Festival of Books is a free, nonprofit event supported in part by donation from viewers like you. If you'd like to support the festival, you can donate in the app or online at humtn.org. That's humtn.org. This session can only go for about 45 minutes, so I'll try and keep us moving today. I'm going to go ahead and start out with some author introductions and bios. First off, we are going to talk with Sanjena Sathian. She is the author of Golddiggers, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, chosen as an Amazon Best of 2021 pick, a Good Morning America Buzz pick, and more. It has also been optioned for television by Mindy Kaling's production company, Kaling International, with Sanjena attached to adapt. Thank you so much for joining us, Sanjena.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second author as well, and then we'll do some readings and we'll start our discussion. Our second author is Helene Wecker. Her first novel, The Golem and the Jinni, was awarded the Mythopoeic Award for Adult Literature, the VCU Cabell Award for First Novel, and the Harold U. Ribelow Prize, and was nominated for a Nebula Award and a World Fantasy Award. Its sequel, The Hidden Palace, was published in June 2021. A Midwest native, she currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and children. Thank you for joining us, Helene.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's go ahead and start. I'd love for everyone to get a sense of y'all's voices and just what's going on in your books. So Sanjena, would you be down to read a little selection from your book and then just kind of tell us what's this whole story about? Just give us a couple broad details.
Sure, totally. So my novel, Golddiggers, follows a young man who is 15 in the first part of the book, and then we pick up again 10 years later when he's 25, 26. His name is Neil. He is growing up in an incredibly claustrophobic, gossipy, and competitive Asian American community in the suburbs of Atlanta, and he is kind of the local underachiever. And he finds that even as he is sort of burning out in his community, his best friend, Anita Dayal, is getting herself a little bit of a leg up by stealing gold from other Indians in their community, smelting it, turning it into a little magical elixir, and drinking it. And when she drinks it, she's able to steal the ambitions and energies of the other people in their community. And sort of behind this whole zany plot and emerging from it is really a story about an immigrant community trying to assimilate, trying to make it in America, and kind of a love story, linking it all up. I'll read from the first chapter of Golddiggers when Neil is 15, and he is kind of on the outs with Anita, his best friend, neighbor, and crush. When I was younger, Anita and Anjali Dayal were held in perfectly fine favor at my house. Anjali is her mom. Our two families mingled pleasantly. As a latchkey kid whose mother was less prolific in the kitchen than Anita's, I often let myself into the Dayal's house to rummage around in the fridge. The key beneath the watering can behind the azalea bush was mine to use. Our parents, the four brown adults in a largely white subdivision, collaborated to create a simulacrum of India in a reliably red Georgia county. But over the past few years, Anita's father, Pranesh uncle, had grown conspicuously absent, discomfiting the other Desi mothers. No one pronounced words like separation. It was stated only that Anita's father was working in California, where he had founded a company with his classmates from the prestigious Indian Institutes of Technology. The official reason for Anita's father living across the country while her mother remained in Hammond Creek was the daughter and a desire not to interrupt her schooling, which is why my mother was overtaken by a frisson of judgment when I came home at the end of May, weeks after spring fling, with the news that Anita would be leaving Okefenokee and, in fact, interrupting her schooling. California, my mother said. I could almost see the Remax Realty signs in her eyes as she dreamt of an open house, overdone chewy sugar cookies and fruit punch and information on the neighborhood's property values. My mother adored open houses. Their mild festivity, the red balloons, the way the houses were held in presentational limbo, vacuumed carpets and potpourri in the powder rooms, until the owner's current unsatisfactory life had been traded out for a better one. To Buckhead, I said. Anita had been accepted to a posh private school in Buckhead, one of the neighborhoods inside the perimeter. The perimeter, referring to Interstate 285, which neatly locked the suburbs away from Atlanta proper, was one of those things to which my mother sometimes mystically referred while in that open house headspace, a state of mind that I swear caused her very large ears to droop and soften, implying that she was listening to something otherworldly, something more splendid than terrestrial gossip. Someday we might live inside the perimeter, she suggested. My father scoffed. In Hammond Creek, we were close to my parents' jobs, good public schools, and other immigrants. Inside the perimeter, he grumbled, were crumbling houses that white people would spend $1 million on because they seemed Margaret Mitchellian. Anita's destination was the school I'd faced at debate tournaments a few times. They never failed to intimidate, showing up with 4 coaches from the best college teams huddled around them. They strutted about in blazers and ties and pearls and heels, while we mopped our sweat with our swamp green Okefenokee High School t-shirts. Her school sat near the long, low lawns of country clubs and the governor's mansion. Its female students would be debutantes, and its alumni seemed, from my position outside its brick-winged gates anyway, to waltz into Harvard and Princeton and Vanderbilt and Georgetown. It made sense. Anita's only plan in life, as long as I had known her, was to attend Harvard. What followed Harvard was a vaguely crimson-tinged blankness. Harvard was sufficient, would propel her into some life thereafter. The first step in achieving that life seemed to be leaving Hammond Creek, Okefenokee High School, and me.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I loved your reading voice, and that was a great selection. Like, I think we saw in that reading, like, there's a lot of lyric in this book. Like, it's about a narrative, right? But it's just fun to read. It's some gorgeous prose throughout. So thank you so much, Sanjena. Helene, would you like to go ahead, tell us about your book, read a little bit for us?
So The Hidden Palace is the continuation of The Golem and the Jinni, which was my first book. In The Golem and the Jinni, we meet Hava and Ahmad, who are respectively a female golem and a male genie. A golem is a creature made of clay, sort of the Jewish Frankenstein's monster figure, usually created to be a servant to a master, but Chava has no master. And Ahmad, the genie, he is a free spirit who is bound to human form by an iron cuff around his wrist. These two happen to meet in 1899 Manhattan, and they go through a number of sort of adventures and a very slowly budding relationship in the first book. And in the second book, the selection I'm reading is from near the beginning. The two have sort of reunited after the events of the first book, and they are trying to figure out exactly what they mean to each other. At last, the first true freeze of winter arrived, and Central Park gave itself to the cold and snow. The vining roses were pruned back to a handful of canes. The elms on the mall grasped the sky with empty fingers. "I'm sorry," the golem said one night as they neared the Harlem Mere. "This will be a long walk back, and it's starting to snow again." "Stop worrying about me," said the genie, "and stop apologizing." "I can't help it. I feel like I'm putting you at risk." You aren't asking me to jump a river, Chava. I can manage a little snow. She sighed. It's just louder now, or it feels louder. Oh, it's hard to explain. She hugged herself as she walked, clearly miserable. With the onset of winter, her clay body had grown stiff and uncomfortable, an expected effect and manageable as long as she walked often enough. But now, like arthritic joints that ached with the rain, the scream in her mind, her trapped creator in his endless anger, had grown sharper, more distracting. She'd begun to make careless mistakes at the bakery, such as forgetting the raisins in the challah dough or doubling the baking powder in the cookies so that they swelled as large as biscuits. Thea Radzin thought it a lingering effect of her widowhood. With each mishap, she cast a pitying look at her favorite employee, thinking, and who could blame the girl if she came unhinged? Do you think I'm coming unhinged? The golem asked suddenly. Do I think what? That I'm coming unhinged. It's what Thea thinks, though of course she doesn't say it. And no, she doesn't understand, but you do. So you must tell me, please. He blew out an impatient and unnecessary breath. Chava, you aren't coming unhinged, whatever that means. The winters are difficult for you. We knew this. It's all of a piece. And you're handling it far better than I would were I to hear that man screaming in my head all the time. You make it sound like he's hurling curses at me, she muttered. It's simpler than that, like a tinnitus, I suppose, just louder lately. Better hear, though? She gazed about at the dark tableau of the park, felt with her distant senses the earth below them, its warmth banked and waiting. The seasons would turn, she reminded herself. Her body would lose its stiffness and unease, and her mind would quiet once more. Yes, she said, better here. Spring arrived as promised. The rains began, forcing them apart and indoors. She sewing in her room each night, he working in the shop. Without him, she grew restless. Her mind strayed toward the couples who hurried by outside, laughing beneath their umbrellas, their thoughts full of what might happen when they reached their warm apartments, their inviting beds. He, too, became tense and distractible, full of unsettled longings, uncertain of their welcome. He, who'd once sauntered up Fifth Avenue so confidently in search of Sophia Winston's mansion. And she, meanwhile, reviewed every conversation they'd ever had upon the subject of faithfulness, his opinions ringing in her mind like a punishment. Humans and their ridiculous rules. But she also recalled something that had happened before the rains had separated them. A night when they passed a Lower East Side synagogue just as two women, clear at a glance as mother and daughter, emerged from its basement stairwell. The daughter's hair had hung down her back in damp coils. She shivered in the night air, nervous and excited, her pale face glowing. The older woman had put a comforting arm around her and had hurried down to the street together, mother whispering to daughter, the daughter nodding. It's late for a bath, isn't it? The Jinni had said as they disappeared. It's a mikveh, a ritual bath, she told him. And then, at his confusion, by Jewish law, a woman mustn't lie with her husband during her menses. Once it's ended, she immerses herself in the mikveh and recites a blessing. Brides do it too before the wedding ceremony. Ah, and the younger one? She marries in the morning. She'd waited for him to call it absurd or superstitious or any of his other usual complaints, but he'd only nodded as though half listening, his expression entirely opaque. Perhaps, she thought at her window, watching the rain. Perhaps.
Thank you so much. One of the things I love about Helene's books, these characters, they're so fun and they're so real and like ridiculously three-dimensional. Like I do not understand it. Like when I'm writing a character, it's always going to feel flat compared to yours. So props to you. Incredible work here.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Sanjena, Helene, is there anything else that we need the readers to know before we start on this discussion, or we think we're ready to go? All right.
Let's go.
Cool. So with The Hidden Palace and Golddiggers, both of these novels have been described as magic realism. Do you agree with this characterization? And what the heck do we even mean by magic realism? Like this is a few questions all thrown together.
Why don't you go first, Sanjana? Because I think your book might more accurately be described as magic realism.
Yeah,
than mine.
I think magic realism is right for me, and I think probably both of our work falls under speculative fiction. I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is sort of where I did my speculative fiction training before going to Iowa for an MFA, and so I think a lot about emotional realism as sort of being like the foundation of most kind of all good literature. And then we have tools to play with, right? You can throw a genre device in there, like make something a thriller that gives it narrative propulsion. You can decide that someone's sort of stream of consciousness narration is going to lead you through the narrative. And in my case, it's throwing a bit of magic into the narrative. So I was always interested in writing about kind of second generation immigrant experience. So the children of immigrants like me. But for me, I spent a really long time trying to write about that from a realist angle. And all of my work was just really somber. It took itself really seriously. It wasn't fun to write. And I don't think it was fun to read. But when I started writing speculative fiction and basically throwing that sort of single variable of magic into my work, all of a sudden things felt more playful. When you throw a speculative device into a piece, it can kind of snowball naturally. You can say, okay, I've changed this one variable. In this world of my book, people drink gold. And what does the gold do? The gold helps them steal other people's ambition. What happens when they steal other people's ambition? And there's this like snowball effect, which is a great way of giving your work structure. And it's also a great way of making sure that you're not taking yourself so seriously, because every time you enter the work, you have to be in play mode. So yeah, magic is right for me.
I like that. Helene, would you speak to your books a little bit? And like, I agree with your statement that Sanjena's is more magic realism. So why the heck do people keep calling you a magical realist online?
You know, it's funny. I go back and forth on it because I feel like, you know, in one sense, I was an English major and I did my like my final paper on magic realism, and so and that was dealing with magic realism like as it was originally like sort of codified as mainly Latin American, maybe some German writers, and it's this sense of like worlds overlapping, and having, being like real people to whom magical things happen that are entirely expected because this is just the world blending in with the world behind the world. So with my own work, it's like, okay, there's some of that, and I do see that. I think the phrase, like the term magical realism, has been sort of expanded, and some academics will probably say diluted or turned into, like commercialized or whatever, to sort of overlap more largely with speculative fiction and fantasy. I think people sometimes tend to use the phrases as something that is like fantasy, but not elves and dwarves. And so I'm taking the real world, I'm taking real world considerations. My books are set in the actual historical past, and I'm plopping down these two folkloric creatures into it and putting them within a framework of real of their own powers and rules. But I'm telling the story from their point of view, and that's where I think maybe it gets a little muddled with, because there are people they're having to hide because people don't believe in them, so they'll be frightened if they know what they are. And there's more of a division, I think, at least psychologically, between like the real world and the magical world than you tend to find in magic realism that way. But that might be splitting academic hairs, so I'm all over on the subject.
I completely understand. Sanjana, one of the definitions that I saw yesterday when I was doing my studious research for this panel, somebody was arguing that one form of magical realism can be kind of a new generation of people. Like it could be completely realistic, but it's somebody coming from one place to another place. So they have their original worldview, like that they grew up with and that they know, and now they're in like a completely different world, moving from the United States to probably any other country. Like that would be a little bit of a shock for most Americans. Like, could you speak to that a little bit? Do you see that as kind of a form of magic realism? Because I think I see at least hints of that in Golddiggers.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Helene said, a lot of when we think of magical realism, a lot of us think of Marquez and then other Latin American writers. And I think often magical realism has been used to sort of like correlate with almost trying to make a political point or writing about conditions of like dictatorship, or like, in Marquez, there's a dictator who's so domineering that he literally moves the sun, right? Things like that. And then Rushdie, who I think is the sort of South Asian progenitor of this stuff, was obviously directly influenced by Marquez. And so I think magical realism becomes very important, almost as a vocabulary of realism, to say this is, as Rushdie says, like the condition of migration is inherently absurd. And so these become really useful tools for writing about our realities. And I think whether or not you import your old folklore, you import kind of the understandings of the old world into the new. That's, I think, often what people are talking about when they talk about magical realism. In my case, I was really interested in that second generation condition. I was interested not just in looking back at the old. In my case, like the characters sort of bring this old magical potion from India, but I'm only tracing it back to the 1980s. Like there's maybe hints that this is a Vedic era, like really ancient recipe, but I don't go that far back. I'm really interested in what it's like when you put that mythological element into a very contemporary landscape and throw in high school dances and parties in like douchey tech world, Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. Speaking of that folklore, and we can talk about folklore and magic, one of the big themes throughout both of these books seems to just be moving, and like, I guess immigration is the word that we would usually use, but just you've lived in one place, you're going to another. Helene, could you start us off by talking about how immigration and folklore / magic work together in your book? And then we'll go to Sanjena.
So I think what the main point of like the overlap in my book is that in my books is that it sort of externalizes the magic and the folklore, externalizes the immigrant experience and makes it sort of huge and larger than life, so that it's not. So I've got these two in the first book. I've got these two creatures who are just sort of plopped down in the middle of humanity by various means, and who have to now pass as human, and so they're not just figuring out where, this new land of America, how do you get an apartment? How do you get a job? They're figuring out, okay, I have to pretend to eat. I have to pretend to breathe. I have to figure out what to do with myself at night because I don't sleep. And so it's just sort of, pressing 1000% on the photocopier and just making it so big and so out here that we can look at it and be like, oh yeah, that's sort of what it feels like. The stakes are a little higher. It's a little weirder. It's sort of more fun in the way that Sanjena said, where it's like more playful, more you can just sort of, put in an aspect and then watch the consequences sort of like cascade downhill. But in that way, it's not like this sort of dark, troubled, internal novel, the way that so many realist immigrant narratives, which are awesome, but if I wanted to write something a little more rollicking, that this is the way to do it. So yeah, I think it was basically what it did for me. Was it just let me write about this stuff in a way that felt a little more fun and magical, while still being inherently about immigration itself and what happens when you move somewhere new and suddenly you are almost turned into a different person in some ways.
That's awesome. Sanjana?
Yeah, I think that one of the fun things about writing something magical, or even just playing with genre, however you do it, is that it's a way of, I once heard the phrase, kind of betraying the truth to tell the truth, which I think is a really nice way of thinking about art in general. Fiction writers make everything up, but it's often easier for me to say something truthful in fiction than it is for me to say something truthful in nonfiction. And I think that's one of the cool things about a speculative conceit, is it lets you literalize the metaphor. So in Golddiggers, I was interested in investigating the kind of cult of ambition and achievement culture that I grew up in this very competitive corner of the Indian diaspora, where, you know, uncles would ask me my SAT score before they asked me how I was doing. And so the realism of that is inherently funny, but I can do more with it on a plot level by creating something that kind of dramatizes that already present element of realism.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just for everyone who's watching, in about 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to take some questions from you all. But I've got a few more here, so we're just going to keep talking. Let's move to talking about time and history in these books. So Helene, would you start us off? What role does, and kind of obvious, and you kind of already spoken to it a little bit, but what role does the past/history play in your novel, and like this idea of the future? Like, is the past something your characters are running away from? Is the future something they're moving towards? Or is that not really what the book is about?
It's a good question, and I think that the answer is different for the two main characters. I've got Hava, who was essentially born, activated, brought to life on the way to America. So she has no real past to speak of. She's essentially, she's like greenest of greenhorns. And then I've got Ahmad, who was stolen away from a life in the desert 1,000 years ago, and he'd already lived for 200 or so years. So he is much more bitter about the fact that he is ending up here in this weird city with all of these, strange creatures that are called humans. And so the two of them come to this reality, this new reality, from two very different places, and they argue about it quite a bit. So I think it's maybe for the two of them, it's not so much about a past as it is about a massive change in a way of life. So that maybe is a little bit different than the rest, but I've got a lot of other immigrant characters in the books who are very much struggling with their own ideas of how much to assimilate, how much to hew to the past, how much to say, well, this is America now, in America you act differently, and just sort of are able to shed some of that old enculturation like skin much more easily than other people. So yeah, it's all along the that whole spectrum of how people react when they come to a new country.
Sanjena, did you have any thoughts about the past, history, the future in your novel?
Yeah. So there are sort of technically 4 time periods in my book. The main 2 are 2006 Bush era, post 9/11 Georgia, and then 2016 Silicon Valley, height of the tech boom. But there are these cutaways to 1980s Bombay, where we kind of learn about where this gold recipe originated, that I kind of alluded to earlier. But the real sort of like component of history, like with a capital H, is this kind of 2 nested stories which take place during the California gold rush. And I was interested in including this component in part because I was already writing about gold in America, and I was like, surely there's a way I can be in communication with the gold rush, because Silicon Valley, people call the sort of new tech boom the new gold rush. It's just so ingrained in American culture, that sort of key period, and we idolize it as like a sort of thrilling period in American history where people struck out on their own and tried to make it big. But I was interested in the greed of it. I was interested in how people depend on greed to kind of make it in a new country. So Neil finds out about this potential Indian man who emigrated to California during the gold rush, and he kind of can't find proof of this person's existence outside a single little story. And he becomes obsessed with that. And he becomes obsessed with what is really the sort of like marginalization of non-white people in American history. And so that was kind of my book's relationship to the past, which is sort of there's a curiosity and obsession with American history because this is where my characters are now trying to make themselves at home. But they're so in the far corners of American history, and they're so silent in the sort of historical record that it becomes really difficult for them to have sort of a full and rich relationship with the past. And I wanted the book to contain that complexity.
Yeah, and writing about time is so difficult. Like I've got a project right now that has at least 3 like plot lines that are happening 20, 30 years apart. Do either of you have advice for me? This is a selfish question. It's not for any of our viewers. How, like, what do we do as especially younger authors trying to figure out how to play with time? Do you have any advice for people working on this? Helene, could we start with you?
Ooh, gosh. I think, okay, there's the functional advice, and then there's more like the psychological, spiritual advice. The functional advice is use a trusted system to keep everything in order. The one that I use is called Eon Timeline. It's an app that's a piece of timeline software that you can just nail events in place along different arcs. So the way that I had it when I was writing these books was like the top arc was the world history, the middle arc was New York New York realist history, and then the bottom arc was my characters. And so, because especially in the second book, this became really crucial because I was lining up events along the run up to World War I, and people were moving from country to country, coming from the Middle East back to the U.S. And if in certain years that wasn't getting possible anymore as the Mediterranean became blockaded by various navies. So that really, and I'll get email. If I just have someone sailing to the U.S. in the middle of World War I get email about it. So it does become a bit constricting and infuriating at times. Why can't I just go back and change history? But the other part of it, I think, would be have in the beginning when you're thinking about this stuff and you're setting up the book, like the themes of the book and the flow of the book, have certain waypoints or resonances that you already have in mind, whether it's like just simplistic symbolism or a character that is thinking almost the same thought as another character in a different timeline. Just because what we're doing when we're playing with history is we are finding these resonances, and we are looking for the ways in which like all history professors anywhere just know that history, people just repeat themselves. People constantly rediscover the new thing, from generation to generation, and they think they're the first ones to think of it, but it doesn't work that way. So just to be able to, in a more personal and identifiable way, view that long and cyclical arc of history in your characters. Just have there be like touch points that you can see the resonances and the reflection.
Kind of like save points in a video game. Like we just got to have these main areas.
Yep.
I appreciate that. That's going to be helpful. Sanjena, do you have anything there?
It sounds like Helene is way more organized than I am, so you should take her advice. My workspace is covered in like a mad woman's post-it notes and like 6 different notebooks that I lose track of. I totally agree with that sort of wanting to have conversation across the time periods, both thematically and in terms of character. And then the sort of nerdy craft advice that I always like to pass on is this idea about point of telling, which sort of refers to where the narrator, if it's a first person narrator, but also kind of where the book, if it's a third person narrator, where the book sits in relation to the events of the story. So in my case, like I have a first person narrator, so I needed to know how, like where Neil was sitting and how that affected the way he understood 2006 and 2016 and 1849 and the 1980s. And even if we're writing in third person, like the book has sort of an ontological relationship to its subject matter. What does it want to know about each time period? The way we think about our teens is very different than the way we think about like when we're 17. then it's different than how we would think about it at 27. And I think history is like that too, right? The way we think about the past is inflected by where we are in the present, and we look for different things in the past. We look for different resonances to explain what's happening today. So having a sense of what that is, like what the sort of hunt through the past is probably useful.
My workspace sounds more similar to Sanjana's. I look like Charlie Day and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, like 3x5 cards and like string. And I'm just like, all right, well, how could they do this if they weren't even born yet? All right, hold on.
I probably made it sound a lot more neat than it actually is. I also have the 3 notebooks with the 7 pages written in each of them, and I did Post-its at one point, and it was it's a mess. It's always a mess, and then I have to clean up the mess.
It's almost like none of us know what we're doing, and we're just trying to make beautiful things. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, all right, so sorry.
Too real.
Okay. We've got just a few more minutes of questions. I'm going to kind of try and go back and forth between the kinds of questions we've been asking and then some that are a little bit more fun, pop culture-y. Let's go ahead. Sanjana, have you seen the television show Silicon Valley? And if so, could you talk about how accurate it is, or just like, I don't know, just tell us about your experience watching it after kind of being in that world and knowing that world better than the average American?
Totally. So I moved to Silicon Valley in 2013. And it was kind of the height of the craziness out there. I lived there for 2 years. This is before I think America turned on the tech world. It was before people were like, oh, maybe Facebook is bad for us. And obviously now we're in that like kind of backlash moment. But I moved out there like a lot of Asian Americans, I think, do, because it's this sort of like promised land. I think particularly for Asian Americans who have been raised in this like achievement worship culture that my characters are also raised in. And Silicon Valley, the show, was not satire. Like, it's realism. Like, it's very funny, but it is realism. It is like, there's a scene in the pilot where the main character, Richard, who's just created this new app, goes to the doctor after having a panic attack, and then the doctor starts pitching him on his own app. That happened. And that's actually the stuff that the second half of my book is playing with, is the sort of absurdity that people take for granted out there. And it's the result of a culture that treats greed as ambition, which is why we have so many billionaires who we have trusted with our world, and now we're feeling betrayed that they've let us down. That's what the second half of my book becomes really critical of.
Absolutely. Helene, you can speak on Silicon Valley, but I was really interested in what you thought about the 2019 adaptation of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats.
I have never seen Cats. I feel at this point I shouldn't see Cats because I just want to live in the discourse around cats. And it's one of the things, it's the sort of thing where if you see it, you might develop your own opinion about it. And really, I just want to look at other people's opinions about it and feel like sort of, just sort of warm and bubbly inside looking at other people deriding it. I read Andrew Lloyd Webber's, I don't know if you guys saw, he was so, this came out a couple days ago, he was so distraught after watching the movie that he went out and got a therapy dog. And I thought that was just the most delicious detail, and it can't get any better than that. And why would I see the movie when I can just think about Andrew Lloyd Webber's therapy dog? Because that's just the best. But Sanjana, I haven't seen Silicon Valley, but I living out here in Pleasanton in the East Bay. My neighbors are all sort of ensconced in this Silicon Valley world, and the high school parts of your book felt way too real in some ways, and the Silicon Valley parts felt way too real in ways. And so your book was just it just struck a number of chords that were sort of like, oh, that's just like, you get that sort of frisson of like sympathetic embarrassment. It's like, oh my God, that is exactly how it is, isn't it? Oh my God.
Well, I'm sorry for triggering.
It wasn't triggering so much as just like that awesome feeling. Ugh!
One of the things while I was reading through Golddiggers, especially in those high school scenes, I kept thinking back to the HBO show Euphoria, just because like it's realistic and gritty, but it's holding both of those. Like everybody either makes a way too serious story about teens or a way too light and airy, unrealistic story about teens. And this feels like what Euphoria does, where it's like, no. Being a teen is sometimes really stupid and ridiculous, but sometimes it's also the most serious and deadly thing you've ever done. And so, yeah, I really do appreciate that. Let me ask this. This is much more serious, but also still fun. Like the last couple years have been tough, right? Like everyone nods. Yes, the last couple years have been difficult. So how and where have y'all found joy over the past 2 years? Like, what are the things that you go to, whether it's a friend or a partner or a piece of art or a physical location? Like, what have you done to kind of spark joy, to quote Marie Kondo? Helene,
I've done the opposite of Marie Kondo, which is amass stuff. I was living in New Zealand when the pandemic hit. I was basically between New Zealand and India. I was teaching in New Zealand for 3 months. I was supposed to go back to India on April 1st, 2020. Borders closed. A bunch of my stuff was still in India. Half my stuff was in New Zealand, and then I had sold the rest of it. So I found myself back on a plane to Atlanta, where I grew up. Had to live with my parents for 4 months, which was fun and also like not great at my age. I decided to just settle in Atlanta for a little while. And I haven't had like a place that felt like home in a long time. I spent my 20s moving around a lot. And so I'm talking to you all from my new house where I got a lot of stuff. And I'm not sure all of it is stuff that Marie Kondo would approve of, but literally just having rooms to move through that only belong to me, having my like weird bookshelf tower, like having the room of one's own, again, having that space to sort of create inner space, which is what I think writers and readers need. That's been really important to me.
For me, I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and so when the switch to distance learning happened, the house got a little crowded because also my husband was home, from his job, working at home, and so the house just became overrun with people and Zoom calls, and my escape became gardening. I went out and like everyone else with like a plot of land during the pandemic, I went out and grew some vegetables, and it really helped because you can't doom scroll while you're weeding. It's just not possible. And it was also like just being outside and getting some sunshine. And there's, the world is falling apart, but look at this food I made out of dirt. Like there's something just really basic and soothing about that. So that was one thing I did. The other was I finally watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, which everyone had been talking about for years, and I was just a few years too old. Like I missed it when it was on Nickelodeon. Watched it, my husband watched it with the kids, and then I caught up, and I'm on my third rewatch now. So it's become the thing that I put on the TV while I'm cooking, or if I just need something soothing while I'm paying the bills or whatever. It's like just get to watch the Aang Gang and chill out. So those are my two big pandemic loves, I guess.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I got through about 10% of the questions I had. So thank you so much, Helene and Sanjena, for joining us. And thank you all for attending the festival. Huge shout out to the authors. Remember that the links to purchase the books through Parnassus are posted in the chat. Festival sessions will continue online through October 10th. And again, thank you to Humanities Tennessee and our sponsors, the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. This has been a lovely session of the 33rd Annual and Second Online Southern Festival of Books. Good afternoon and good luck, everyone.
Thanks for having me.